Okay, we're going to make a start. Again, good morning. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the new resource that Taser has been working on economic evaluation. Just before we kick off, I just would like to go over some housekeeping rules. So as you have joined today's webinar, you can see it is webinar format here on Zoom. So your mics are off and your videos are off. But as some of you have been doing already, there is a chat function. So if you did have any questions or any technical issues, you just drop it in the Q&A function. Also, there is closed captioning as well enabled on today's webinar. So if you would like to do that during this webinar, that can be achieved by selecting the caption icon in the toolbar. Today's session will also be recorded and that will be disseminated online. So please do sign up for a newsletter and keep track of your boxes to be notified of that. And also we will be seeking some feedback so we can know where to improve, what went well, what could do better. So again, just check your boxes. We will be sending around a link in regards to that survey so we can get some feedback for today. I believe those are all the housekeeping rules. So let's begin today's webinar. So my name is Nicolette and I am Evaluation Officer here at Taser. I will be introducing and chairing today's session. I am also joined by Dave Innes from RSM UK, our partner in this particular economic evaluation resource. Dave will be taking over from me in a couple slides from now to talk you through the actual economic framework. But for now, you will be with me for the next couple of slides. So do hang on. So just a general outline for today's session, we will be talking about what economic evaluation is and where that falls within the framework of evaluation as a practice. And then we're going to be discussing the rationale and the purpose of the new guidance. And then Dave, like I said, will be taking you through the economic evaluation resource and then showing some of the other accompanying documents that come along with it. And then at the end, there will be time for a question and answer session. That's when I will come back in and then be sharing it with Dave. So like I said, if you do have any questions, please just do put them in the chat, the questions and answer section, or sorry, the chat function, and that will be picked up by me towards the end. I will be keeping a track of it as well. So let's begin today. So what is economic evaluation? What is evaluation? Evaluation is a systematic process of assessing the design, the implementation, and the outcomes of an intervention. And really what the goal is of evaluation is to provide the relevant evidence that not only has been rigorously gathered and analyzed, but to then go about to inform decisions about the value or the impact of policies and programs, but also the appropriate allocation of resources based on this evidence. As some of you may be aware, there are different types of evaluations, some that you are more familiar with others. So each looking at different aspects of the intervention process. So firstly, we have impact evaluation, and that determines whether the intervention causes the observed changes that we may be seeing in, for example, the target population. And then we have implementation and process evaluation, acronym known as IPE, and that examines how an intervention is delivered and what factors are influencing its delivery. And then we have economic evaluation. So what is economic evaluation? So economic evaluation really assesses the cost of an intervention relative to its outcomes or benefits. And really what it does, it helps to really determine the value for money of a program or intervention by comparing the cost incurred to the benefits achieved. And there are different approaches, different types of economic evaluation approaches, and Dave will be discussing some of these approaches that are relevant to the higher education sector. However, I think the illustration just in the bottom right-hand corner kind of sums up what economic evaluation is trying to do. And most often what we want to know is whether the money, if that's £20, £20,000 or £150,000, whether or not, if that money that we put towards an intervention has been effective and impactful, and specifically how it has contributed to, for example, educational outcomes, the outcomes that we're interested in. And really, what economic evaluation does is really provide the framework, but also the methods to go about answering such questions by really quantifying the relationship between costs and specific outcomes or benefits achieved. So this guidance really has been designed to provide those working in evaluation or other related roles within higher education providers with really the tools to implement the framework in order you to go about conducting a robust economic evaluation. And really, what the guidance does is provide like a really clear step-by-step approach to conducting an economic evaluation. We've also included examples that are very relevant to the higher education sector, demonstrating how each step can be followed throughout. But we also, like I said, have developed a protocol and a reporting template that allows you to kind of translate that information into really clear and digestible format to then that can be used, for example, then to go about reporting your findings. So this is end of my section right now. I'm going to hand over to Dave that will then continue this section and go on to talk about the resource. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to Nicolette for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Dave Innes from RSM, and just before I start talking through the framework for economic evaluation, I just wanted to say, make a couple of acknowledgements, because I'll be presenting what we've developed on behalf of RSM. And TASO, but what we've developed wouldn't have been possible without hard work of colleagues as well. So just want to acknowledge the work of colleagues Priya Kambaita, Ina Yordanova and Matt Rook, as well as we also received brilliant advice on this from Dr. Stuart Astill as well. And all of us in the project team were really delighted that TASO asked us to develop the guidance, firstly, because I think economic evaluation is really important. And then secondly, because getting guidance that's tailored to the needs of the sector should hopefully be really beneficial for people trying to implement economic evaluation in HE. And hopefully that's lots of you that have joined us this morning. Now, just wanted to start by talking about, apologies, went on slightly too far. Just wanted to talk about what we did to get to the point of developing the guidance, because it certainly wasn't a case of just starting off and writing something down. So the development of the guidance was based on a desk-based review and a set of stakeholder engagement. So the first thing we did was a desk review, looking at what was out there already in terms of economic evaluation practice and guidance in the HE sector in the UK, and other sectors in the UK, and then also the HE sector in other countries as well. And without talking through all of the findings, one absolutely key one for us to understand was that as far as we could see in terms of published evidence, there was actually relatively little economic evaluation activity happening in HE if we compare that to other sectors within the UK and also to HE in some other countries, in particular the US. And then secondly, some of the other sectors also had some more tailored guidance that was already developed, which is very helpful to see in terms of thinking about how you could take a broad approach and specialize it towards the needs of a specific sector. So then secondly, we conducted a stakeholder survey and set of stakeholder interviews, and we had 37 responses from evaluation experts working in higher education providers. And followed that on with 4 interviews with people working on or interested in economic evaluation. And if any of you are on the call who participated in the survey or the interviews, thank you very much, because they were very beneficial for us. And just to pull out a few of the really key findings there, it was interesting to us that nearly half of people who responded to the survey said that they hadn't used any of the economic evaluation approaches that we listed in there. And so, even among a fairly self-selecting group who are interested in economic evaluation, it seems that lots of people haven't actually used those methods before. And there was a lot of desire that came through for some tailored guidance that really captured specific outcomes around access, success, and progression, which are obviously a big focus of TASO's work. And then thirdly, the biggest barriers people saw were around measuring and monetizing benefits themselves. And those two aspects are, are obviously given a big focus in the guidance that we've developed. Now, the first part of the guidance just talks you through things to think about before starting an economic evaluation. And as Nicolette says, economic evaluation is all about comparing the value of outcomes or benefits created by an intervention with the costs and the resources required to implement that intervention. Or very simply, it's in terms of thinking about getting you the most bang for buck from doing something, or how, in other words, we often talk about getting the most value for money from something. And really, there's three sorts of questions you're quite likely to be asking if you're conducting an economic evaluation. So the first is or was an intervention worth doing? And quite simply, that's in terms of, is what you've got from the intervention in terms of the outcomes and the benefits enough to justify the costs of doing that intervention? Secondly, is or was the intervention the best thing that could have been done, or the best thing that you could be doing? And that's in terms of when we're thinking about, there's lots of different things we could be doing. Maybe we narrowed it down to 2 or 3, and we want to know which one will provide the greatest value for money there. And then the third question is, maybe we've done an intervention or a set of activities, and we want to think about, okay, how can value for money be improved in future? Now, if you look at the first two questions, you've probably noticed that says, is or was the economic evaluation worth doing? And that's because you might use economic evaluation at different stages in the intervention process. So you want to, before you start, think about exactly when you're going to use economic evaluation as well. So the first thing you might want to do is use economic evaluation to inform a decision about choosing between different programs or interventions. So as I said, you might have narrowed it down to choice between 2 or 3 things, and before you implement it, you could use economic evaluation to say, well, actually this one looks like the one that's going to give us best value for money, so let's go for that one. Secondly, you might have conducted an intervention or activity and want to know whether you should do it again. So you want to look back at that activity and say, well, did it create enough value for money to justify being done again? And then thirdly, you might be trying to inform budgeting decisions within the higher education provider by identifying the programs or interventions that actually have the greatest value for money. So you might be saying, well, these ones look really good for value for money. These are the ones that we should be prioritizing. So again, it's really good to start out on this with a good idea of at what stage of the intervention we want to conduct an economic evaluation and how you're going to use it. Then also, so the key challenge for us in developing this guidance was making sure that we put down absolute best practice procedures. So, it's really important that the things that we recommend that you do to conduct an economic evaluation include best practice methods, and they're things that are detailed in guidance such as the HM Treasury Green Book and other procedures that would give economic evaluation credibility if it's shown to kind of external stakeholders. But also we were really keen to make sure that this is something that could be accessed and practiced by people without existing economic evaluation experience. So the development of the framework and the guidance has really tried to strike that balance of ensuring credible methods, but also you should be able to come to this and pick up the framework and the guidance, and it give you kind of all the detail that you need to conduct an economic evaluation, even if you haven't conducted one before. So in terms of what you do need to have in place to conduct the guidance, as we say, an evaluation experience, it's not required to have previous economic evaluation experience, but it is very helpful if you have got some experience of other evaluation approaches, and in particular impact evaluation, because there are fairly close links between impact evaluation and economic evaluation that I'll come on to slightly later. Secondly, it's not required to have any advanced quantitative knowledge. There are some technical bits of economic evaluation. We've tried to provide the resources to be able to do those technical bits without having substantial technical knowledge on them, and I'll come on to those slightly later. Now, to do those, it is very useful to have fairly basic knowledge of something like Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets that you can use to access the resources that we've put in place to do those calculations. And then thirdly, in terms of the team of people that you need for this, so to conduct an economic evaluation, you do require quite a lot of knowledge about the intervention itself. So it is required that you have either yourself or people involved in the economic evaluation knowledge of the intervention and the outcomes that have been created. In terms of measuring costs and understanding broader impacts, it's also helpful if you can involve people like students themselves or finance staff in the evaluation as well. Now, the next step of the guidance, once we've ensured you've got things in place ready to conduct an economic evaluation, is how to choose the right economic evaluation approach. And I should say, with all the steps in the guidance, there's more detail in the guidance that you'll be able to access online than what I'm able to cover today. The aim of this session is to give an overview and some of the detail, but really enable you to then take it away with a good understanding of what you need to do to conduct an economic evaluation, that you can then go away and use the guidance which provides more detail. But the approaches that we cover in the guidance include cost benefit analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, cost consequence analysis, and social return investment, which I appreciate. There's a lot of kind of cost analysis, there's lots of similar phrases there. But it's important to understand the fairly subtle differences between them, because those differences are very important when we come to choose an approach to economic evaluation to conduct. Now, cost benefit analysis is about comparing all individual social and environmental costs and benefits of an intervention, but by assigning a common unit to them. And that's really important. And that normally that is in terms of valuing them in monetary values. And that's really important in terms of valuing in a common unit, because it means we can say something about the size of benefits relative to the size of costs. And that's the key aim of cost benefit analysis. Now, cost effectiveness analysis compares the costs of an intervention, so the cost of alternative interventions or alternative ways of producing the same unit of output. So that's important in the sense of you don't need to measure an output in monetary terms to use cost effectiveness analysis, but you would aim to compare interventions that are producing the same output or benefit, and saying which one of them has the lowest costs or which one's the most efficient way of producing that output. Now, cost consequence analysis compares the costs and outcomes of alternatives, but the aim here is to lay out what the costs and the outcomes are, but not necessarily compare them directly in the same terms. So it does a similar thing to cost benefit analysis, but doesn't aim to get to the point of applying a common unit to the costs and the outcomes that can mean they can be directly compared. And then the fourth approach that we outline here is known as a social return on investment approach. And here it actually does something very similar to cost benefit analysis in terms of it aims to consider individual social and environmental costs and benefits of alternative interventions, and ideally, where possible, in monetary terms as well. So it actually aims to do that similarly to cost benefit analysis. However, the main difference with cost benefit analysis is that it actually takes a more flexible approach to measuring and valuing impacts. So to explain that slightly more, cost benefit analysis has typically been defined quite clearly in documents such as the Treasury Green Book, with a fairly strict hierarchy in terms of approaches that can be used, whereas social return investment is just a bit more flexible and allows things like qualitative methods to be brought in. Now, through the guidance, I'll explain on the next slide, but cost benefit analysis is one of the core approaches that we recommend there are a few elements of the social return on investment approach that we incorporate in our approach. So when we talk about cost benefit analysis, it's a slightly less strict form of cost benefit analysis that would be defined in the Treasury Green Book, just to allow some of those SROI approaches to be brought in. Now, going from that, here are 4 methods. We actually recommend that there are 2 methods that you're most likely to find beneficial to use in an economic evaluation context. And those are cost benefit analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. So on following slides, you'll see CBEA and CEA. And most of the time, we think you're likely to want to be in a CBA approach where you're wanting to conduct that full cost benefit analysis. And that's because cost benefit analysis is the best approach to use when you're wanting to compare the value for money of a program or intervention with other programs or interventions that are aiming to achieve different intended outcomes. So very often in the HE space, you may want to be thinking about different sorts of student outcomes and wanting to know where best to spend money on interventions. And CBA gives an approach where we can compare those interventions with different outcomes and say which one has higher value for money. Now, there is one situation, a fairly specific situation, where we think a CEA approach is the best one to use, and that's where you actually focus on comparing different interventions but aimed at a single outcome. So it may be there's a specific focus on something like student well-being or student mental health, and you want to compare different interventions aimed at that same outcome. Now, in that situation, CEA would be sufficient to achieve the aims of the economic evaluation. But because it's the core method that we think is most applicable and most likely to be the one that you want to use, the following slides focus on developing the framework for CBA. So in the next stage of the presentation, I'll go through the steps to conduct cost benefit analysis, and we've developed a framework to do that, which is a step-by-step guide to do that, and then a set of guidance that details the sub-steps and the detail to conduct each of those steps. And here are the 7 steps, just to show what it will take, and then I'll go through each of them in turn. So to conduct a cost benefit analysis, what you would need to do is first set out by developing a theory of change. Second, identify what the costs and benefits are. Thirdly, identify a set of data sources that will enable you to measure those costs and benefits. Step 4 is about estimating what the costs of the intervention are. Step 5 about estimating what the benefits of the intervention are. And then step 6 is about how we compare the benefits and costs directly. And then step 7 is about reporting. So moving on to the first step. Now, it's important to say that developing a theory of change is not specific to economic evaluation. So, it may well be that you've conducted a theory of change for another evaluation that has already been conducted, which could be an IPE evaluation or an impact evaluation. But a theory, if you haven't already conducted a theory of change, then that would be the first thing to do to set out on an economic evaluation. And that's because developing a theory of change is really important for us to understand what the costs and benefits are of an intervention. Now, a theory of change describes how change is expected or assumed to come about from the program or intervention. And as I say, the theory of change should be the thing that underpins the following stages about mapping out what the costs and benefits are. And that's because the costs themselves are very related to the inputs into the intervention, and the outcomes and impacts should be closely related to what you're identifying as the benefits of the intervention. And as I say, it may be that that theory of change already exists by the time you turn attention to the economic evaluation, but if it doesn't, then that should be the first step that you go through here. Now, I wanted to show you what a theory of change should look like, and this is one of TASO's examples. Now, TASO actually have resources to develop 2 different theories of change, which are closely related, and this one shows their core theory of change. There's obviously quite a lot of detail on the slide there, but that should show you what a theory of change should look like. And I think the important thing here for the purposes of economic evaluation is in terms of the theory of change should really identify what the key goal or objective of the program is trying to achieve. But then secondly, it details what those expected relationships are between the inputs in the inputs to the activity or the program, then what's being done in the activities, and then the knock-on effects on outcomes and further down the line impacts. And we'll come on to these shortly, but those inputs are very closely related to the costs of the program, because the inputs detail what resources you need to implement the interventional program, and the outcomes and impacts are very closely related to the benefits of the program, because they are the things that we are hoping are the value that's produced by the intervention or program. So once we've got our theory of change in place, the next step is on identifying what the costs and benefits are. And the first place you should look to build on to do that should be the theory of change. Now, a cost of the program means using an input to carry out a program or intervention, and that may be a financial cost, or it may be using some alternative resource. So the sorts of things you're likely to be identifying as the costs of an intervention in HE are staff costs. So obviously staff time required to implement something, required to run a program, the use of buildings, administrative costs, equipment costs, and things like investment in branding. So obviously to run interventions, quite likely to use some space within the university, quite likely to use some administrative costs for organisation, things like IT equipment that may be required. And broadly, you're just thinking about all the resources required to implement that activity. Now, a benefit is a positive outcome or impact resulting from the program or intervention. And that's a fairly broad thing, but it could include lots of different types of outcomes or impacts that you've identified in the theory of change. And just to give some examples of the sorts of things that are likely to be relevant to interventions in HE, we may be thinking to do with things to do with applications to HE. If it's an access program, we may be thinking about enrollment to HE. We may be thinking about increased student well-being. We may be thinking about increased retention in HE, so people carrying on to further study. We may be thinking about improved attainment, or further down the line, we might be thinking about postgraduate earnings or wages. And then the last thing on this slide are disbenefits. Now, disbenefit is maybe the sort of word that only an economist could come up with, because it's fairly unintuitive. You may be thinking, hang on, isn't disbenefit just a cost? But actually, there's an important difference between them, because a disbenefit is a negative outcome or impact resulting from a program or intervention. So whereas we think of costs as being to do with the inputs required to carry out an intervention, disbenefits are still outcomes and impacts that happen further on down the line, but they're negative ones. And some of those may be anticipated. So it might be anticipated that to run an intervention, we've got to, it's going to create some disbenefits, or they may be unanticipated ones that, were not expected, but we've looked at an intervention and actually it has had some negative outcomes and impacts as well. So just to give some examples, it may be that by putting in place an intervention, it's actually lowered student well-being, or it's actually reduced student attainment. And it's really important within the economic evaluation as a whole that you're identifying any disbenefits as well, because they will obviously affect, including those in the economic evaluation, will obviously affect the overall value for money that's been assessed. So then just to give, and then when we're thinking about identifying benefits and disbenefits, it's important to be thinking about benefits that are both to individuals, who are in this context mainly students, benefits that accrue to the HEP as a whole, and then benefits that are wider and societal. And when we're conducting a cost benefit analysis, we should be focused on identifying as many benefits as broadly as possible across all areas, and cost benefit analysis actually gives us a tool by which we can incorporate all of those benefits within our assessment of value for money. And when we're thinking about individual benefits, now I think it's very helpful to distinguish between benefits related to access, to do with people pre-university and pre-HE, gaining access to HE, success within HE, to do with increased student well-being or retention in HE and attainment whilst there, and then progression into to do with what happens after HE in terms of postgraduate employment or wages and life satisfaction. And to those of you that have used other TASO resources, I know that access, success, and progression distinction is something that fits neatly across lots of other TASO resources. And then the sorts of things we might be thinking in terms of benefits at the HEP level are an increased completion rate, or increased application rates for postgraduate learning. And then in a society level, it may be things like increased diversity in local workplace or increased contribution to local gross value added. And at this stage, when we're thinking about identifying costs and benefits, the key thing is just to be thinking as broadly as possible and identifying all of the benefits that should be in scope for the economic evaluation. Now, so I mentioned that the theory of change should be your first port of call for identifying costs and benefits, but there are lots of other resources that you could rely on as well. So firstly, lots of resources that TASO have developed, and that includes TASO's mapping outcome and activity tool, which map onto that access, success and progression framing distinction that I mentioned on the previous slide. So they have a pre-entry moat, an attainment raising moat, and post-entry moat. And those include measures of outcomes that are very likely to be relevant to lots of interventions that you are thinking about. Then additionally, there's lots of secondary resources that will also have details on outcomes that are relevant here. And they include TASO's evidence toolkit, resources developed by the Office for Students, including their Equality of Opportunity Risk Register. Advanced HEs, have done work around student success, and then you may also look at the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework. Now, as well as relying on resources that are out there, working with stakeholders to identify costs and benefits is something that we emphasize quite a lot in the framework and guidance. And this is something that actually draws, as I mentioned, on that social return on investment approach, which is something very much emphasized in that approach. And I think that's really important because different stakeholders bring lots of different knowledge of costs and benefits, but also, broadly the theory of change. And they may be really helpful for understanding both the costs used in running an intervention and also the outcomes and benefits that are achieved as well. So we recommend that, as well as relying on what's been written, it's very helpful to also identify stakeholders, which might include students, staff that are involved in other related programs, or employers if the intervention has an employer focus. And the staff there may include people like finance staff who may have, detailed knowledge of costs that are useful to draw on. By identifying those stakeholders that you can work with early on, and including their knowledge, can be really helpful for just making sure that you've got all costs and benefits covered in this step. Now, so moving on from there, the next step is to identify what data sources you're going to need to collect for costs specifically. And here it's important to distinguish between different types of costs. And this is something that's covered in more detail in the guidance. But just wanted to mention some different kinds of costs here. And the reason it's important to distinguish between different types of costs is because the data sources that you'll need and the ways that you'll be able to, and what you'll need to get in place to measure them is actually different for different types of costs. So, for example, when we're thinking about financial costs, which relate to something that is paid for, monetarily, um, the sorts of things we might be thinking about there are, if we've paid for marketing or outreach, purchased specific materials, or purchased equipment, then data on those costs might be found in either intervention level accounts, if there's been an account drawn up for that intervention, or maybe something you could get from the finance department. Now, in-kind costs are where a resource has been used, but there's no financial transaction that's happened specifically for that resource. So, for example, if for an intervention, it requires a member of staff to spend, say, 10 or 20% of their time on that intervention, but that time isn't kind of paid for by a budget somewhere, then that would be an in-kind cost because it's a contribution of resource, but there's no financial transaction for it. So here to measure that cost, you're going to have to understand things like staff salaries, and then you can use the share of time spent on that salary, as I'll show you. So the share of staff time spent on the intervention, which I'll show you slightly later. But you're going to therefore need to maybe talk to the HR department to understand what staff salaries are, and then also gather data on the number of hours spent on the intervention. And a third set of costs are indirect costs, which are where a resource is used, but it's an additional kind of administrative or support resource that you're drawing on part of, and again there isn't a financial cost that pays for that. So it could be that, for example, you're drawing on off broader kind of administrative or IT resource, that's kind of necessary to have in place for an intervention, but it supports, broader set of activity, and it's only part of that resource that is being drawn on. And here it's quite likely that the best source would be discussing with a finance department. Apologies, doesn't seem to be moving to the next slide, which I'm not sure. There we are. Has moved now. Apologies for the delay. So, and then relatedly, the next step is identifying data sources to measure benefits. And to give some examples here, so for example, if we're thinking about enrollment in HE, we might be looking at institutional data, higher educational statistics data, or data from DFE. If we're looking at things like increased student well-being, we might be looking at HESA again, or conducting, local survey data. If we're looking at increased postgraduate employment and wages, we might be thinking about data from HESA or OFS, or something like the Longitudinal Educational Outcome Survey, LEO data. And there's lots more examples provided in the guidance here. This is to just give a flavour, but I think the key point is we need to work out what the benefit is, and then really narrow down and focus on how could we get data to measure that benefit. Okay, so moving on to the next step. So once we've defined a benefit, defined our costs and benefits, and identified data sources to measure them, the next stage is estimating what the costs are. And this I will talk through just drawing on one example. So just want you to think about imagining you've run an intervention, and that is a careers fair aimed at increasing the percentage of students from areas with lower participation to progressing it to higher skilled employment. And for example, you've identified there are 4 key types of cost that you need to include in the economic evaluation. And the first is producing a banner and flyers for the careers fair. Second, staff time taken to run and set up the careers fair. Thirdly, using the HEP premises to run the event. And fourthly, using buying IT equipment to organise and run the event. Now, the first of those on the production of banners and flyers is a financial cost. And as I said on the previous slide, that is because a financial cost is those where money is being directly used to purchase the cost. So if we want to look at how to estimate that's the cost of banners and flyers, it's actually fairly easy. So we might go into intervention accounts, or maybe have to discuss with the financial department. But let's say we could just directly identify that. So financial cost, that one was £300. Now, the second type of cost is slightly trickier. So here we want to include the staff time taken to set up and run the careers fair. Now that one, we're assuming this staff time hasn't been purchased directly, so this one is an in-kind cost, and that's because the in-kind costs are where a resource is used, but money isn't allocated to be spent on them as part of the intervention. But the resource has still been used, so we need to reflect it as in our costs. Now the example here, let's assume we've got 2 staff members, and we know their salary, and we know one of them spent 5% of their time on running the careers fair, and the second one spent 10% of their time over, as I should say, we're assuming this is 10% of their time over a year to run the careers fair. And this table shows that what we would need to do is identify their gross salary and then include their employer contributions, employer national insurance contributions, and their employer pension contributions. And the reason it's important to include those is because including them gives the total cost of that input rather than just looking at their salary cost, which doesn't reflect the total employer cost of that member of staff. And as we can see at the bottom, we can use what's in the table to then estimate what those in-kind costs for the 2 members of staff have been. So in the first case, it would be just over £2,000. In the second case, it would be just under £3,000. Again, more details on the calculations are provided in the guidance document. So that gives a quick overview of how to estimate costs. Now, the next step is estimating benefits, which is probably which is a bit that requires the most work of the guidance. And as we said at the start, in terms of our stakeholder engagement, this was identified as probably the biggest challenge in implementing economic evaluation in HE. And so consequently, it does receive a good amount of focus in the guidance. And although it's one step in the framework, I think it's important to think about it in terms of 3 separate sub-steps. So to be able to estimate benefits overall, what we're going to have to do is identify an impact of the intervention on each of those benefits. There's then a second step once we've identified the impact of monetizing them, which means we may have identified an impact on something like student well-being, which is measured in a certain metric. We've got to then think about, well, what was the monetary value of that benefit itself? And then thirdly, there might be some situations where it's not possible to monetize a benefit, when we call those non-monetizable benefits. So we show a way that those broader non-monetizable benefits can be included within the cost benefit analysis framework. Then the next few slides, I'll go through these sub-steps in turn. Now, so step 5.1 is about identifying the impact of the intervention on each benefit. And actually, this step is very closely related to impact evaluation. So if it's the case that you've already used an impact evaluation to look at the outcomes of an intervention, it may well be that you're able to draw on those results to inform the economic evaluation. So as we put on the left-hand side, in an absolutely ideal scenario here, you'll be able to draw directly on an impact evaluation that reliably estimates the impact of the intervention on each benefit. But it may also be the case that you want to conduct an economic evaluation in a situation where you haven't conducted an impact evaluation. And we also don't want to limit ourselves to only being able to say something about the value for money of an intervention if we've been able to conduct an impact evaluation. We actually want economic evaluation to be a broader tool that can be used in situations where we haven't got that impact evaluation to build on. So if we're in the situation where that's not been the case, we recommend drawing on existing information where possible. So it may be we have something like a pre and post survey that can be used to identify the impact. It may be we're looking at secondary data to explore impacts, and it may be that we're we're able to look at broader things where someone's implemented a very similar intervention somewhere else, and we're able to look at what impact similar interventions had elsewhere. And I won't go into the detail here, but in the guidance, we recommend adjusting identified impact according to the rigor of the evidence that underlies it. So if we've got at the very highest level an randomized controlled trial, say, that has been conducted on the intervention itself, we can be fairly confident that the size of the impact identified by that RCT is reliable, and we can use that in our economic evaluation. If we're relying on something like just a pre-post survey comparison, we recommend using what we call an optimism bias adjustment, just reducing the size of the impact identified to recognize the less rigorous evidence drawn on to identify it. And then a third important thing here is that it may be that we've got a fairly reliable identification of impact on, say, a short-term outcome. But what we want to include in the cost benefit analysis is something that happens further down the line. So let's say, for example, we've run an intervention which has improved student attainment in the short run, but actually we want to include in our cost benefit analysis an impact on graduate earnings further down the line. What we might want to do in that situation is draw on further kind of wider evidence on the causal links between that short-term outcome and the longer-term outcome, and conducting a little literature review might be helpful there. Now, we recommend identifying research that is ideally type 3 evidence to conduct there. There's more information about what type 3 evidence is on the TASO website, but is essentially evidence that can be reliably used to inform a causal effect of that short-term outcome on the longer-term outcome. Now, the next step, so we've identified an impact on the outcomes and the benefits we want to include here. The next stage is thinking about, so how do we move from those impacts measured in the unit that they've been measured in, and that will very much depend on what the benefit is, to a unit of monetary terms. And the reason this is really important is because to be able to compare the size of those benefits with the costs and the resources required, we need to have those two things valued in the same terms. So money is the unit that we normally use to do that. And before I talk about methods for monetization, there's two really important considerations here that should guide the approach that you need to think about. And the first is that when we're including benefits in our cost benefit analysis, we should be focusing on what we call end benefits. And by that, we mean benefits that are at the end of, further to the right of the theory of change. And these are things that are valuable to people or to the higher education provider directly. So, for example, these could be increases in earnings for a student. This could be an increase in applications to a HEP because that's beneficial to them. But what we don't want to include both those kind of short-term benefits that are important to get to those end benefits and the end benefits, because if we're counting the value of both of those, we would actually be double counting the overall benefit of the intervention. So our first step here is, before we monetize benefits, identify those sets of end benefits that are really the things that are valuable to people or the HEP or wider society as a result of the intervention, and focus on including and monetizing those in your cost benefit analysis, rather than thinking you've got to value every single outcome that's included in your theory of change as well. And then the second really important point is that what we need to be focusing on here are the additional benefits that are realized by the program, rather than just valuing the benefit itself. So, for example, if one of our main benefits is student well-being, what we're focusing on here is valuing the additional improvement in student well-being as a result of the program, rather than saying what is the benefit overall of student well-being. And the impact evaluation, that we've built on should give us the way to do that, because the impact evaluation is looking at what the additional impact to the program on a particular outcome is. But just wanted to reiterate at this stage, when we're talking about monetizing benefits, we're talking about monetizing that additional improvement in a benefit or outcome, rather than trying to value that outcome as a whole. Now, this is one point where I want to just give you an overview of what the main kind of monetization approaches we recommend that you focus on are. But it's also a point where it'll be very useful to go away and see what's in the guidance to get a more detailed view of more detailed overview of each of these methods. But so once you've identified those sets of end benefits that the CBA should seek to monetize, the next stage is identifying what method you might want to use to monetize each of those end benefits. And there's three main approaches that we think are most likely to be applicable in HE. And the first is that quite often one of the main aims may be improving graduate employment and earnings. Now, for some interventions, they may happen further down the line, but also from an individual student perspective, that is one of the key aims of undertaking something in HE. So very often, one of the aims will be, further down the line to improve graduate employment and earnings. Now, that may include, as we said, some sort of identification of an impact on a short-term outcome that can be linked to that very long-term outcome or impact through a literature review. And if that is the case, then actually it's relatively easy to monetize that outcome, because graduate employment and earnings are already valued in market prices. Now, again, there's more detail on this in the guidance. One important thing to be aware of is we should be looking at the improvement in employment and earnings that's a result of the program, rather than the overall benefit of, say, the HEP on someone's employment and earnings. A second approach that we think might well be useful is what's known as the well-being approach to monetizing. The well-being approach to valuing well-being benefits. And we know that improving student well-being is likely to be a focus of quite a lot of interventions that people are considering. Now, here there's a fairly well-developed approach that now there's additional guidance in the Treasury Green Book on, which enables you to value improvements in well-being, but only if you have asked questions that are very specifically worded, related to a set of questions that have now been standardized and used in a set of surveys that have previously been used to value well-being. So if you're interested in using a well-being approach, it will be important to identify that fairly early, so that you can build in those personal well-being questions that have been used in the ONS. And again, there's links in the guidance to those questions. But if you build those into survey tools early on, that may be something that enables you to use the well-being approach to monetizing those benefits further down the line. And then the third approach, and this is another part of our guidance where we draw on that social return investment kind of toolkit that, as I mentioned, enables a kind of broader set of methods to be drawn on for monetizing benefits than would be used in a traditional cost benefit analysis approach as it's described by the Treasury Green Book. The third approach are kind of qualitative approaches that can be used. And there are a few qualitative approaches that we point you to in the guidance that could be used. And these are kind of, so qualitative data collection, but the underlying aim here is working with people who have benefited from the intervention, designed to identify what their willingness to pay for the intervention is. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but that essentially means trying to get them to state how much they would have been willing to pay to get the benefits that they did get from the intervention itself. So thirdly, it may be the case that we've measured some outcomes and benefits of the program, but actually there's none of those monetization approaches that are feasible here. And it may be that they're not feasible because there isn't a reliable approach that can be used, or it may be that they're not feasible because using that approach would require additional data collection that's beyond the budget that you've got for the evaluation. What we recommend in that case is using a qualitative assessment to gauge what the scale of those benefits and disbenefits are. So we wouldn't try to put them into monetary terms, but we would still try to say something about the scale of those benefits. And then later on, we can draw on that scale to say whether the size of those non-monetizable impacts is likely to materially affect what we've determined the value for money based on the monetizable impacts would be. So that will hopefully make sense a bit more in a few more slides, but to show you what the impact, what the scale that we recommend you use here is. So we recommend that you measure that benefit in its own units and terms. So that may be a well-being benefit, and maybe something else for the students, and then then try to apportion an impact size to the size of the measured outcome or benefit. And so that ranges from a large adverse impact, which relates to a large disbenefit, which is likely to have a material impact on VFM, all the way through to neutral, that there's not much an impact either way, all the way through then to large beneficial impact, which would be a large benefit likely to materially impact on the VFM. And in a few slides time, I'll show how to use this impact size to come up with a final value for money assessment. So moving on to step 6, which this in a way is probably the most technical step in conducting an economic evaluation. Now, fortunately, it's also the most standard step. So the calculations required are a bit technical in detail, but they're also, you effectively need to do the same calculations for every economic evaluation. So what we've been able to do in this step is produce a spreadsheet that will run those calculations for you. So I'll run through what the calculations are, but essentially you would need to get to this step with a set of inputs into the calculations based on the previous 5 steps. And the spreadsheet then would run the calculations and provide the right output for you. And when we want to compare costs and benefits, now the thing that one thing that matters a lot for comparing them is considering when those benefits appear. And the reason is that when we compare them across time, we have to adjust for 2 different things. So the first are the effects of inflation. And that's because costs and benefits should be compared in what we call real prices, which are those adjusted to strip out the effects of inflation. So for example, if a good is going to increase in price by 10% over the next 3 years, we want to strip out the impact of that inflation, so that we're comparing in terms of the real value of goods and services and benefits created by an intervention. In our tool, we use the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts of inflation to adjust. But again, you don't have to. In the guidance, you would in future have to download the latest ones. But the tool will do the calculation for you. The second thing that we have to adjust over time for is what we call discounting for time preference. This is something that's standard practice in cost benefit analysis, and reflects that people generally prefer to receive goods sooner or later. So we apply something called a discount rate to benefits that appear in future years relative to today. So for example, something that happens in 10 years' time is valued slightly lower than something that happens in next year or the year after. And as I say, that's very standard practice in cost benefit analysis, and we use the discount factors and discount rates that are used in the Treasury Green Book. And here's the point, and then once we've done those adjustments over time, this is the point that we calculate two metrics which really form the main output from the cost benefit analysis. So we've gone through all the steps, and these are the two main metrics that we want to produce to be able to say something about the value for money of the program. And those two things are the benefit cost ratio, which is measured by the total present value of all benefits divided by the total present value of all the costs. Now, just to explain, present value there just means discounted value. So this is after the calculations have been done. We effectively say, well, what's the ratio of all the value of the benefits compared to the value of all the costs that we've included. And then the second key metric we'll want to look at is what's known as the net present value. So again, the present value there just means discounted value, which is measured by the total present value of all the benefits, subtract the total present value of all the costs. And the example on this slide should hopefully show you why both of those metrics are really important to look at the value for money provided by a program. So the example here is, let's assume that you're comparing 3 different interventions, A, B, and C, and you've gone through all of the steps for each of them, and you've calculated the benefit to cost ratio and the net present value for each of those for each of those interventions. Now, the benefit to cost ratio essentially shows you how much larger the benefits are than costs. So, for example, for intervention A, that shows that the benefits are 80% bigger than the costs, whereas the net present value shows you how much bigger benefits are to costs, but in absolute pound terms, so rather than as percentage or as a ratio. And the reason we would want to look at both of those is, in the scenario we've got here, different interventions could come out top on each of those metrics. So for example, the one with the highest benefit to cost ratio is intervention A, but the one with the highest net present value here is intervention B. And that would be because intervention B must be a more costly, kind of higher value intervention. So it might not achieve as big a benefit to cost ratio in percentage terms, but actually achieves bigger net benefits in monetary terms. And actually, you want to look at both of those things to decide which one provides best value for money. And it may be in different contexts, you choose different ones. So it may be that if you're, for example, not particularly budget constrained, but just want to create the biggest net present value overall, then intervention B is the one to go for. It may be you're in a situation where you're looking at, we just want to know the highest kind of percentage terms value for money interventions to prioritize in a budget setting process. And in that situation, you would think of intervention A, because you may be able to scale up intervention A and get to bigger net present value overall. So there's lots of considerations that would be very context specific once you've got to this point, but that's just to explain you'll want to look at both of those metrics and really understand the local context to understand which one has the highest value for money. Now, as I mentioned previously, it may be that we're not able to monetize all benefits. So in that situation, we want to be able to include those non-monetizable benefits within our cost benefit analysis. And the way that we recommend that you do this is by identifying a value for money category associated with the interventional program. And those categories kind of have equivalents in terms of what the benefit to cost ratio metric is that are shown in this slide. So there is a kind of so there is a corollary in terms of that hard metric, but identifying these broader value for money categories means then we can calculate a BCR based on the monetizable benefits we've been able to look at, but also then incorporate the non-monetizable benefits as well. So for example, if we look back at if we kind of add on to the example I had a couple of slides ago, where we've looked at three different interventions and given them a cost benefit analysis based on steps 1 to 6. But then for each of those, we've got some non-monetizable impacts to include as well. So it may be that we look back at the VFM categories I had on the previous slide and say, well, on the basis of those, on the basis of the monetizable benefits that we've been able to include in that benefit cost ratio, both intervention A and B seem to be medium value for money, whereas intervention C is acceptable value for money. But then we look at the non-monetizable benefits as well, and let's assume that intervention A has we've identified a large beneficial non-monetizable benefit, and for intervention B, a slight beneficial non-monetizable benefit. Now, we could then look across at the monetizable and non-monetizable benefits as a whole and say, well, actually, for intervention A, that non-monetizable benefit is likely to be enough to push it up to a new value for money category. And so we'll assign it a high category on the basis of including that as well. So what we're doing here is a bit more of a broader qualitative assessment that includes those non-monetizable benefits. So we've still been able to include them alongside our monetizable benefits, but without trying to directly monetize those non-monetizable ones and give them a pound terms, an exact pound terms figure, but we still included the scale of those benefits to come up with an overall value for money assessment. And that completes the technical aspects of conducting the economic evaluation. The final step in the report is reporting on it. And here we've got a template that can be accessed online and just details the sections of the report and what should be included to report on an economic evaluation. So the final thing I wanted to show you just before hand back to Nicolette are just to give a very brief overview of the resources that you'll be able to access as a result of this project. Now, the two main documents that we produced are a framework for economic evaluation, which provides that clear seven-step approach to conducting an economic evaluation, and details what should be followed, the framework that should be followed to conduct the economic evaluation. And that's accompanied by a guidance document that provides more detail and examples on each of those steps. So for each of those steps, we take an example, which is hopefully on an intervention that is related to the sorts of things that you will want to conduct an economic evaluation on, and provide examples of how that step can be implemented in a HE context. Now, those two main documents are accompanied by an economic evaluation protocol, which is something that you should fill in before conducting an economic evaluation. And this is similar to the sorts of protocols you might fill in for an IPE or an impact evaluation, but details the steps you intend to follow to do so. And really make sure you're getting the aims right and the steps that you're going to follow right at the outset. Then we've also got a reporting template that I just showed you that shows everything that should be included in an economic evaluation report to ensure that the methodology has been being followed and explained transparently, and the results are being communicated effectively. Apologies. Oh, there we are. And the final resource is, as I've mentioned, a spreadsheet that can be accessed either in Google Sheets or through MS Excel, which can be used to do the adjusting for inflation and discount rates and computing the net present value and cost benefit ratio of the project. So the spreadsheet gives a tool where you can take the inputs from the previous steps, which will essentially be monetary values of the costs and benefits of the project in each year, either the current year, past years, or future years, and then it will adjust for inflation, adjust for discount rates, and at the end compute those metrics that you can be used as an assessment of the value for money of the programme. And I believe that brings me to the end of my slides. So thank you very much. And at that point, I will pass back across to Nicolette.
Thank you so much, Dave. Okay, so now it's time for the questions and answers section. So the first question that we have here for Dave is, in what context or scenarios do you see the most need for economic evaluation?
Yeah, fab. Is that one for me, Nicolette?
Yes, so it's for yourself, yeah.
Fab. I will. Excellent. Well, it would be good to hear suggestions from anyone in the chat as well. But I think the key thing for us is that what we've hopefully provided is a flexible tool that can be used in lots of different scenarios. So as I say, what was important for us is to provide a tool that's tailored to the needs of the sector, but also flexible enough to be able to cover interventions aimed at different parts of the student journey that relate to that access, success, and progression focus that I know is a lot of the focus of TASO's work. So hopefully what we've got is a framework that's flexible enough that can be used, for example, by someone thinking about an outreach program aimed at, school children from disadvantaged backgrounds and thinking about whether they're improving access or consideration of application to HE, as well as at another end of the scale, an intervention aimed at somewhat, improving success rates in final examinations that then lead to improved graduate earnings in the long run. So hopefully what we've got is a flexible tool that can be used to lots of different things that are relevant to people.
Okay. I mean, that's definitely what we need, because so many contexts and perhaps have different provider contexts and stuff. So it's good to have a tool that can reflect that. Another question from a participant here says, how are the value for money categories determined? Are there any standard ones for different types of policy/interventions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. And the first, I think first thing to say is that at the moment, these are determined on the basis of what have been used in a couple of other sectors. And we thought it would be helpful to give some suggested categories, but they're certainly not fixed. So there's actually a recommendation within the guidance that over time they may be adapted for HE as a whole. And the HE sector may want to adapt those because they think that those categories don't quite reflect the scale of benefits that are likely to be in the HE sector, or it may be that you might want to you may want to adapt them for specific types of interventions. I think one thing that is important is identifying what those categories would be before you conduct an economic evaluation. So for example, you wouldn't want to conduct one and then say, well, I'm using these categories for these cases. So if you wanted to, you would have the flexibility to define those categories slightly differently if you want to. But if you were doing that in a different way to what we've put in the guidance, that's the sort of thing that should be specified in the protocol that you put in place before conducting the economic evaluation.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer, Dave. And just to reflect on it, it's always good to try to be as transparent as you can during all the processes. Because again, it helps for those following on that maybe be in the same scenario as yourself to not make the same mistake as well. So we also have a different question here regarding basically graduate earnings is used as an outcome here in regards to the economic evaluation, but they're querying on whether in the short term, if at all possible, is economic evaluation possible when you're looking at short-term outcomes, for example?
Yeah, so it absolutely is. And I think, so the important thing is in terms of which outcomes you're going to look at and monetize, the important thing is to very much adapt that to the intervention that you're looking at. So it may be that for some interventions, you're very much interested in shorter term outcomes that can be directly measured as a result of the program. So for example, something like improvements in student well-being or student mental health may be some things that you might be able to measure impacts within the timeline of the intervention, through a survey or through some other data collection. And so there may be some interventions where you're very much focused on those shorter term outcomes and want to measure them. I think one thing to reflect in terms of whether you can use longer term impacts on graduate outcomes as part of the intervention and what that means for data collection is that you could use those in an economic evaluation, even if you're conducting that before you've had chance to measure those directly for the cohort that are taking place. And just to explain that in more detail, so what you might be able to do is measure a short-term outcome that you know is related strongly to that longer term impact on graduate earnings and employment. So for example, if you had a measure an improvement in student attainment in the short term that you were able to measure as a result of that program, and then you had that wider evidence that you could use to link that shorter term outcome to the longer term outcome, so the employment and earnings outcome, if you've got strong enough evidence there, you could still use the employment and earnings improvements as part of the economic evaluation, even if you don't have the time to wait 10 or 15 years to directly measure whether that's actually happened.
Thank you so much. And we also have a different question here saying, can this guidance be used to do a cost benefit analysis for a program where you have multiple activities as part of in a year, for example? Can it be done in that way?
Good question, and the answer is yes, it absolutely can. I think what you would have in that situation is probably a slightly more complicated theory of change than the example that I've shown you. So it would just be a less linear theory of change in terms of inputs, activity, outcomes. I mean, any theory of change, as soon as you start to specify it, will have several outcomes and the arrows moving several directions. But if you've got several activities taking place, that's just a slightly more complicated theory of change. But following that step, the rest of the economic evaluation can proceed along exactly the same steps in terms of identifying costs, identifying what those outcomes and benefits are, and proceeding with measuring and monetizing them and comparing them in exactly the same way. So yes, definitely can be used when there's several activities.
Great, thank you so much for that. And then we also have a different question here saying, can we also monetize additional costs if the intervention is not delivered, such as cost of non-continuation, cost of underemployment if detected in the graduate survey, these sorts of outcomes? Can those be monetized?
Interesting. So I think that's a good question. And in my understanding, so I think this is to do with if you have something in place and then withdrawing an intervention that's in place, that can create create costs at that point in terms of resources that have been put in place for the intervention that are no longer used efficiently or effectively afterwards. Now, that definitely can be incorporated within the economic evaluation, and I think the way to do that would be in terms of at the outset specifying the options that you're choosing between. Now, when economic evaluations, or sometimes when we're choosing between different options, we call it economic appraisal, actually. But so when conducting an economic appraisal, we would often specify, 3 or 4 different options we're choosing between, and sometimes that option would be defined as what we call a do nothing option or a do minimum option, which would be continuing existing activities, or a business, so a do minimum option, which might just be finishing the activities, or a business as usual option, which may be just continuing the activities that had been in place on their original form. And in that case, specifying both of those options would be important at that stage, because the business as usual option would just include the continuing use of those resources, whereas the do nothing or do minimum option of just cancelling the activity at that point in time, that would need to consider what happens to those resources if the activity stopped but the resources are still there and there's some cost from not using them optimally. So that would be picked up in the do nothing or do minimum option. But I think the key point there is it's all about specifying the options that we're considering at the start of the process and defining those well in terms of the actual options that we're considering on the ground. And then that lays the basis for which costs and benefits we're identifying and measuring further down the line.
Okay, thank you so much for that response. And then I've got a question here as well. If we don't have good causal links between an intervention and outcomes, can we still do economic evaluation?
It's a good question, and the answer is yes, but it will be very important that we communicate the strength of evidence well. So in exactly the same way as I mentioned briefly, but again, it's another situation where there's kind of full detail in the guidance. In terms of we should adjust the identified impact for the strength of the evidence that we have to rely on. It will be really important to do that for the additional causal links we might be relying on between those shorter and longer term outcomes as well. So for example, in the guidance, we have a suggested a table that you can use for justifying those estimated impacts and benefits for the strength of evidence that we have to rely on. And we call those optimism bias adjustments, with the basic idea that if you've got some very, very strong evidence, such as a randomized controlled trial, you've got a fairly reliable measure of what the impact of the evaluation has been. We can use that measure in our economic evaluation. But if we are relying on looser quality evidence, so that might be just a pre and post survey of the cohort that are in the intervention, we might be able to use that survey to identify an impact. Let's say it improved a specific outcome by 50%, but there's some uncertainty there, and it might be some of that improvement would have happened anyway without the program. So what we don't want to do is say, oh, well, let's not conduct economic evaluation in this situation. Let's only limit ourselves to when we've got absolute best quality evidence to base it on. I think that would be a shame, because there's lots of situations where we can learn a lot from economic evaluation, even when we haven't got that fantastic gold standard evidence to build on. So we want to have a flexible tool. We can make sensible assessments of value for money, even when we haven't got an RCT or very high quality quasi-experimental impact evaluation. So what we might want to do in that situation where we've got a pre and post survey is apply some sort of optimism bias adjustment. I can't remember the specific number, but it's something like adjusting downwards by 20 or 30% to say, well, we've estimated an impact that might be, higher than the actual impact is, so we're going to adjust it down a little bit to carry it forward into our economic evaluation, and that will give us some basis for estimating the scale of benefits relative to costs. So it means we can still proceed with, a value for money assessment, even if there's some uncertainty. And I think the other key point is that there's in the reporting then that we do, is very important that we communicate the strength of evidence we've got to rely on, and the the assumptions that we've made, the adjustments to that factor that we've had to make, and also the uncertainty about the size of the effect that we've estimated.
Thank you so much. So yeah, just to say, the guidance does, as Dave has alluded, cover those type of circumstances where necessarily the link may not always be as strong, and the guidance does cover that as well. So that can be answered through reading it. And then we also have another question here, looking at basically when, for example, the impact is subjective, such as maybe an improvement in sense of belonging, how useful is it then to go about translating such a subjective experience through multiple quantitative filters to a proxy monetary value for money, especially, for example, when programs across institutions are doing this quantifying process differently?
It's a good question, really good question. And I think, well, a couple of thoughts on that one. Number one, so that there are going to be situations where there are outcomes that are, the main thing we want to achieve, and they are difficult to monetize and include in a cost benefit analysis. Now, it may be possible to do so, but I just wanted to recognize, there are situations when it's going to be more difficult, and it may be that some of those more subjective things are more difficult to follow all of the steps through to conduct the full economic evaluation. Now, however, second thought is that it may still be possible, and very similar to the approach I mentioned for well-being, there are now quite a lot of standardized approaches to measure personal things that seem quite subjective, but to measure those using standardized survey questions that have been asked in very similar ways in different contexts, and actually give us a very standardized way to ask those questions. Now, the well-being part of that is the part I've seen mostly, and have used there, but I know that TASO have, I believe, developed similar resources for other sorts of behavioural questions that they know are related to harder educational outcomes and important, and there are standardized ways of asking questions that you may be able to look at there. The other thing to mention is that so there are different monetization approaches that could be used, and there's a bit more detail that you might want to have a look at what's in the guidance there and just see if there's something more relevant to that sort of outcome than the three that I had up on screen earlier.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going off what Dave said, the point in regards to the set of questions that we have it's called the Access and Success Questionnaire. It is then linked as well throughout the guidance document and the framework. So unfortunately, we've got about 2 minutes left of the webinar, but I think this would be a good time to close. The questions that are left, we will most probably follow up, and I've made a note of them. So I will try to follow up on them. I just want to say thank you so much to Dave for joining today. I also want to give thanks as well to RSM colleagues as well for all the hard work that they've put in today. It was or into the actual resource over the last couple of months. It was a great experience, and as always, thank you so much for joining the webinar. Dave, did you want to say something before we go?
Just thanks from me as well, Nicolette. As I say, yeah, very happy to have been able to produce the project. Really enjoyed working on it, and very much hope that what we've produced is helpful for those on the call. So yeah, thanks, Nicolette, and to your colleagues too.
No worries, and like I said, it was amazing having everyone here today. Thank you so much for joining. And if there are any questions, please do feel free to email us, or you can always email me directly or TASO directly, and we're always happy to help and assist. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a beautiful day. It's sunny here in London. Be productive, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.